Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be answering the question of what biblical fiction is and what biblical fiction isn't, at least in my opinion. So if you don't know what biblical fiction is, for starters, I have done a whole video, actually quite a lot of videos on biblical fiction, so be sure to subscribe to my channel and maybe scroll back and check out a few of those because I pretty much never stop talking about biblical fiction. I get asked questions all the time about, is this book Christian fiction? Or is this book biblical fiction? Or what's the difference between Christian fiction and biblical fiction? And does this book count? So today I'm just going to be giving you guys a brief definition of the many categories that biblical fiction is and maybe isn't. So for starters, biblical fiction, first and foremost, is a subgenre of Christian fiction. So biblical fiction can be Christian fiction, but Christian fiction isn't always biblical fiction. It's kind of like a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle isn't a square kind of thing, or whatever it is. What? I barely passed geometry, y'all. So essentially, biblical fiction is a subgenre of Christian fiction that is considered historical fiction that takes place during a biblical time period or during a biblical story. The most obvious example of biblical fiction is, of course, going to be biblical fiction that is about a specific biblical character or a biblical figure. So what does that mean? That means taking a true story that is accounted for in the Bible and then expanding on it to create a novel based around that story or around that person's life. One example of such a book is Miriam by Misu Andrews. If you couldn't tell from the title, Miriam by Misu Andrews is a biblical fiction novel or a biblical novel that retells what the life of Miriam, sister of Moses, might have been like according to this author. So that, of course, places it in the biblical fiction category because it's historical fiction, it's set during biblical times, and it is about a biblical figure. However, biblical fiction doesn't always have to be about a biblical figure. It can be about something like a biblical event featuring all fictional characters. An example of this would be Connie Lynn Cassette's Out from Egypt series, which begins with Counted with the Stars by the lovely Connie Lynn Cassette. This book is about a fictional girl named Kia who experiences what the Exodus might have been like according to this author. So there is no main character in this book that is specifically mentioned in the Bible. All the characters in the book are fictional, except for, of course, a few mentions of Moses or a few mentions of Pharaoh. But overall, the story itself is a work of fiction that is based on real events or events that happened according to the Bible. So if you're sticking with me, that means that there are two kinds of biblical fiction. Biblical fiction about biblical figures that we know existed, and biblical fiction about biblical events featuring fictional characters. Except that's not always true either. Sometimes biblical fiction is biblical fiction just because of the setting. A good example of this would be Angela Hunt's The Silent Years series. The Silent Years series is a series of books that takes place during the time between the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament. So this series is about a series of stories that are never directly covered in the Bible or aren't mentioned in any specific biblical passages that cover the stories, but they are events that happened during biblical times. So if you're following, a biblical fiction book can be about a specific biblical figure whose life we fictionalize into a novel form, a specific biblical event that features true events and true stories, but with fictional characters in them, or a fictional story or perhaps a historical story that is biblical fiction because it is set during Bible times, during the time in which the Bible was written, or in a biblical setting like ancient Israel or ancient Palestine. However, it's going to have, of course, an uplifting message since it's a subgenre of Christian fiction, but it might not be specifically about a biblical event or a biblical figure. It might be a biblical fiction novel because it takes place in a biblical setting. I hope that wasn't too confusing for you, and if I wasn't making it confusing enough, I'm about to throw another knife into your heart. In my opinion, there is a difference between a biblical fiction or a biblical novel and a biblical retelling. Why? Because the biblical retelling is in a different genre. A popular example of a biblical retelling is Redeeming Love by Francine Rivers. This is a historical fiction novel that retells what the life of Hosea and Gomer would have been like had it taken place in the 1800s. So the setting of this book is, of course, historical. The story takes inspiration from a Bible story, but it is not a direct retelling of that Bible story. It retells it in a different setting with different characters, so it just takes inspiration from the Bible story. In my opinion, that would be called a biblical retelling, not necessarily a biblical fiction novel, because it doesn't take place in Bible times, and it's not about real biblical figures, and it doesn't take place during a biblical event. Another example of a biblical retelling would be True by author S.E. Clancy, which is a contemporary retelling of what the life of Rahab might have been like had it taken place in a contemporary setting. So while the story takes inspiration from the Bible and the characters are based off of real biblical figures, the story itself is contemporary. It takes place in a contemporary world and the characters are fictional. So I would consider that a contemporary book that is a biblical retelling. I would consider this a historical book that is a historical retelling. But they aren't biblical fiction in genre because they don't take place in a biblical setting. So, to summarize, we have biblical retellings, biblical fiction that takes place in a biblical setting, biblical fiction about a biblical event featuring fictional characters experiencing that event, and biblical fiction about biblical figures who are mentioned and written about in the Bible. I hope that answered your question of what biblical fiction is. If you still have more questions, then don't worry because I have tons more videos. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jenna Van Mourik. I'm an inspired writer and an inspirational fiction reader who reads, writes, and lives for Jesus. I enjoy reading and writing Christian fiction, especially biblical fiction. You can find more information about me as well as all my other links in the description box below. I'm active here on YouTube weekly, posting bookish videos and interviews with authors. And I'm active on social media pretty much every single day, Twitter, Facebook, and especially Instagram. So make sure you check out all those links if you want to keep up with what I'm reading, writing, and what I'm doing on a daily basis. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!